Chapter 9, Unit 9, Period 9, Part 9.1, Contextualizing Period 9. Setting the stage, America after the Cold War. All right, let's talk about Period 9, the stretch from 1980 to the present. Think of this era as the moment America looked around after decades of Cold War tension and asked, okay, now what? The world had been organized around one big idea, us versus the Soviets, and suddenly that organizing principle was dissolving. What replaced it wasn't one clean answer, but a whole constellation of forces pulling the country in different directions at once. Your job on the AP exam is to understand not just what happened, but why these changes unfolded the way they did and how they connect to everything that came before. The conservative turn. The most important contextual shift you need to anchor in your mind is the rise of conservatism. By 1980, many Americans felt burned by Vietnam, by Watergate, by stagflation, that painful combo of high inflation and high unemployment that baffled economists in the 1970s, and by what they saw as the cultural upheaval of the 1960s. Ronald Reagan's election wasn't just Ronald Reagan's election wasn't just a political event. It was a signal that the ideological center of gravity in American politics was shifting rightward. Reagan's coalition blended free market economics, social conservatism, and muscular anti-communism into a package that felt to millions of voters like a return to clarity after years of confusion. On the AP exam, you'll want to connect this moment to earlier threads: the backlash against the New Deal and Great Society programs, the Southern Strategy, and the growth of evangelical political activism in the late 1970s. Period 9 doesn't begin in a vacuum. It's a response to Period 8, globalization and the economy. Now layer on top of that political shift a massive transformation in the global economy. The word you absolutely need to own is globalization, the accelerating integration of By the 1990s, someone had knocked down the walls between the pools and created one giant interconnected ocean. That has advantages: cheaper goods, expanded markets, new opportunities, but also serious disruptions. American manufacturing jobs moved overseas as companies chased lower labor costs, hollowing out industrial communities in the Midwest and South. The debates you hear today about trade policy and economic inequality have deep roots in these structural changes that accelerated after the Cold War. Common AP pitfall here is treating globalization as purely an economic phenomenon. Don't do that. It's also cultural, political, and technological. The spread of American pop culture, the internet, and multinational institutions like the World Trade Organization are all part of the same story. Technology and the information age. Speaking of the internet, you cannot contextualize Period 9 without talking about the technological revolution. The digital age didn't just change how Americans communicated, it restructured work, politics, social life, and even identity. The AP exam loves to ask about the consequences of major changes, and the rise of the information economy is a goldmine for continuity and change questions. How did it widen How did it transform political organizing? How did it change the nature of American democracy? Keep those questions in the back of your mind as you move through the rest of the unit. New World Order and its complications. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, American policymakers faced a genuinely unprecedented situation. The United States was now the world's sole superpower, what some scholars call a unipolar moment. The temptation was to think history had essentially been settled in America's favor, that liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won. That optimism collided hard with reality in the 1990s, and especially after September 11, 2001. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the rise of global terrorism, and the eventual emergence of new rivals like China complicated the triumphalist narrative considerably. For the AP exam, understand that American foreign policy in period 9 oscillates between engagement and retrenchment, between optimism about spreading democracy and deep anxiety about the costs of doing so. Social and cultural tensions. Finally, don't sleep on the demographic and cultural transformations of this period. Immigration, particularly from Latin America and Asia, reshaped American cities, politics, and culture in profound ways. The country became more diverse, and that diversity generated both remarkable creativity and intense political conflict. Debates over immigration, multiculturalism, affirmative action, and civil rights for LGBTQ plus Americans all belong to this contextual frame. A useful mental image. Think of period 9 America as a country simultaneously becoming more globally connected and more internally divided over what that connection means for national identity. A quick mnemonic to keep your context pillars organized. Gets D is Drew globalization. Globalization at G. As we move into the specific events and developments of this period, you'll see how all of these contextual forces, the conservative turn, globalization, Part 9.2, the end of the Cold War. Setting the stage. Imagine you've been playing a chess match for 40 years. You're exhausted. Your opponent is exhausted. And one day you look across the board and realize they're out of pieces. That's essentially what happened to the Cold War by the late 1980s. The United States didn't win by launching a missile or invading Moscow. It won through economics, ideology, and the sheer weight of sustained pressure. Understanding how that happened is exactly what the AP exam wants you to explain. Reagan's strategic pressure. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he came in swinging. His approach to the Soviet Union was fundamentally different from the détente of the Nixon and Carter years. Reagan believed that the USSR was not a permanent fixture of the world order, but rather, in his famous words, an evil empire that could be defeated, not just contained. This matters for the exam because it represents a shift from containment toward what some historians call real black. The centerpiece of Reagan's pressure campaign was the Reagan Doctrine, which committed the United States to actively supporting anti-communist resistance movements around the world in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, that meant backing the Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet invasion, a conflict that became the USSR's own Vietnam, expensive, demoralizing, and unwinnable. Alongside that came the Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, nicknamed Star Wars by critics. Reagan proposed building a space-based missile defense system. Whether it was ever truly feasible is debatable. But its strategic effect was enormous. It forced Soviet leaders to contemplate an arms race they simply could not afford. The Soviet economy collapses. Here's the analogy that'll stick with you. Imagine running a sprint while wearing a backpack full of bricks. That was the Soviet economy in the 1980s. Centrally planned economies are notoriously inefficient, prices don't reflect real supply and demand, innovation stagnates, and resources get misallocated on a massive scale. Meanwhile, roughly 25% of Soviet GDP was being funneled into military spending to keep pace with the Americans. The system was cracking under its own weight. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized the crisis. He introduced two landmark reform policies you absolutely must know: Glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost loosened restrictions on press and political speech, a dangerous gamble because once people can speak freely, grievances tend to come pouring out. Perestroika attempted to decentralize and partially marketize the Soviet economy. The AP exam loves asking you to evaluate these reforms, so remember this key insight. Gorbachev was trying to save the Soviet system, not dismantle it. His reforms instead accelerated its collapse, a classic case of unintended consequences. The wall comes down. The most dramatic visual of this entire era is the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. For your essay responses, don't treat this as a random event. Connected to the cascade of forces that made it inevitable, Gorbachev had signaled that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to prop up communist governments in Eastern Europe, abandoning the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Once Eastern Europeans understood that Soviet tanks weren't coming, the dominoes fell fast. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, one by one, communist governments collapsed or reformed. The Berlin Wall, that ultimate symbol of Cold War division, was torn apart by ordinary citizens with hammers in a single night. The Soviet Union dissolves. The final chapter came in December 1991, when the Soviet Union itself officially ceased to exist, breaking into 15 independent republics: Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Central Asian republics, all suddenly sovereign nations. This is a massive AP pitfall. Students often conflate the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, with the dissolution of the USSR, 1991. They are two separate events, 2 years apart. Get those dates right. What this means for the exam. A few things to keep locked in. First, the end of the Cold War resulted in what President George H.W. Bush called a New World Order, American unipolarity, meaning the U.S. briefly stood as the world's sole superpower with no peer competitor. Second, the arms reduction treaties of this era, particularly the IMF Treaty, 1987 between Reagan and Gorbachev, demonstrate that even during intense rivalry, diplomacy never fully stopped. Third, AP free response questions often ask you to argue causation. Was it Reagan's pressure, Gorbachev's reforms, or internal Soviet contradictions that ended the Cold War? The best answers acknowledge all three working together rather than crediting a single cause. A useful mnemonic for the key factors: REGSD, Reagan's pressure; economic collapse, Gorbachev's reforms. Three forces, one outcome. With the Cold War framework dismantled, the United States now faced a world full of new and far messier challenges, and that's exactly where we're headed in the next section on post-Cold War foreign policy. Part 9.3, A Changing Economy. The Great Economic Shift. All right, let's talk about money. Specifically, how the American economy went through a dramatic metamorphosis starting around 1980 and continuing right up to the present. If you had fallen asleep in 1975 and woken up in 2005, you would barely recognize the economic landscape. The factory floors that once hummed with the sound of steel and machinery had largely gone quiet, replaced by the soft glow of computer screens and the invisible transactions of a service-based world. Understanding why this happened and what it meant for real Americans is exactly what the AP exam is going to ask you about. Deindustrialization and the Rust Belt. The cornerstone of this section is the process by which manufacturing declined as a share of the American economy. Think of it this way. Imagine your town's biggest employer, the factory that employed your grandfather and your father, suddenly closing its doors and moving to Mexico or Vietnam, where labor costs a fraction of what it costs in Ohio. That's not a hypothetical for millions of Americans. The industrial heartland, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, earned the grim nickname the Zero First Belt because its factories literally rusted after being abandoned. Why did this happen? Two big forces were at work. First, globalization meant American companies could manufacture goods far more cheaply overseas. Second, automation meant that even factories that stayed in the U.S. needed far fewer workers. Common AP pitfall here is conflating these two causes. Globalization sends jobs abroad, while automation eliminates jobs entirely. They're related but distinct, and the exam loves to test that distinction. The rise of the service economy and the Sun Belt. As the Rust Belt rusted, something interesting was happening in the South and Southwest. Cities like Atlanta, Houston, Phoenix, and Dallas were booming. This region, called the Sun Belt, attracted businesses and workers alike, driven by lower taxes, cheaper land, warmer weather, and, critically, a growing By the late 20th century, more Americans were working at desks, hospitals, and restaurants than in factories, mines, or farms. This is a structural economic transformation, and you need to be able to explain both its causes and its human costs. Technology, finance, and the new economy. Here's where things get really interesting for the AP exam. The 1990s brought an explosion of Think of financial deregulation as loosening the guardrails on a mountain road. In good conditions, traffic flows faster. In bad conditions, the crashes are catastrophic. That catastrophe arrived in 2008 with the Great Recession, triggered by the collapse of the housing market and the risky mortgage-backed securities that Wall Street had been packaging and selling. Income inequality. The gap widens. Perhaps the most important social consequence of all these economic changes is the dramatic increase in You might see references to the Gini coefficient in your reading. It's a statistical measure of inequality ranging from 0 perfect equality to one person owns everything. America's Gini coefficient rose notably from the 1970s onward. The AP exam won't ask you to calculate it, but you should understand what it measures and what its rising value B means. A memorable way to think about this: imagine the economy as a pizza. When the pizza was being made in factories, a lot of workers got a decent-sized slice. As the economy shifted, the pizza got bigger overall, but the slices were cut very unevenly. A few people got enormous portions, while many others got just crumbs. Globalization and NAFTA. You cannot discuss this era's economy without mentioning on the AP exam. Resist the urge to label NAFTA as simply good or bad. Instead, explain that it reflected the broader tension of globalization, aggregate economic gains distributed very unevenly across society. The common AP pitfalls. Two trap students fall into constantly. First, they describe deindustrialization as purely a Reagan-era policy choice rather than a broader structural economic transformation. Avoid that oversimplification. Second, they forget to connect economic changes to social and political consequences. Union decline, wage stagnation, political polarization, and the rise of populist movements on both left and right, all trace back to the economic shifts you just learned about. Quick mnemonic to lock in the key themes. FD, DG, TI, FD. FD, digitalization. Globalization. Part 9.4, Migration and Immigration in the 1990s and 2000s. Let's talk about one of the most dynamic and consequential forces shaping American society in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The massive wave of migration and immigration that remade the demographic face of the country. Think of it like a river, slow to start, but once it gains momentum, it reshapes the entire landscape. That's exactly what happened to the United States during this period. And the AP exam absolutely wants you to understand the causes, patterns, and political reactions to this transformation. The scale and sources of immigration. First, let's anchor ourselves in the numbers. By the 1990s and 2000s, the United States was experiencing immigration levels not seen since the early 20th century. And here is the key thing to remember. The origins of immigrants had shifted dramatically from earlier waves, thanks largely to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which you should already have in your memory from period 8. The old quota system favoring Northern and Western Europeans was gone. In its place, a system emphasizing family reunification and skills opened the doors to Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. So when you're thinking about this period, picture communities in Los Angeles speaking Korean and Spanish, neighborhoods in Chicago transforming with Mexican and Guatemalan families, and tech corridors in Silicon Valley filling with Indian and Chinese engineers. This is not your grandparents' Ellis Island story. The single largest source of immigration during this era was Latin America, with Mexico leading the way by an enormous margin. Push and pull factors drove this movement, a concept the AP loves. Push factors are conditions that drive people out of their home country. Poverty, political instability, violence, lack of economic opportunity. Mexico's 1994 peso crisis, for instance, devastated the middle class overnight and pushed countless people northward. Pull factors are conditions that attract people to a destination. Job availability, family networks already in place, legal pathways, relative stability. The United States had all of these in abundance. NAFTA, signed in 1994, is a particularly rich AP topic here because it's a two-edged sword. While it was supposed to stimulate economic growth in Mexico, it also flooded Mexican markets with subsidized American agricultural goods, undercutting small farmers and paradoxically accelerating migration north. Undocumented immigration and political backlash. Now, here's where things get politically charged, and the AP exam will test whether you understand the tensions this created. A significant portion of immigration during this period was undocumented, people who entered without legal authorization or overstayed visas. By the mid-2000s, estimates put the undocumented population at around 11 to 12 million people. This became a flashpoint in American politics. The political response was swift and, frankly, contradictory. On one hand, American businesses, especially in agriculture, construction, and food processing, quietly depended on undocumented labor. On the other hand, nativist sentiment and concerns about border security generated enormous political pressure. California's Proposition 187 in 1994 is a must-know example. It attempted to deny public services, including education and healthcare, to undocumented immigrants. Federal courts ultimately blocked most of it, but its passage revealed the depth of anti-immigration feeling, especially in states most affected by demographic change. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996 toughened enforcement mechanisms significantly, and after September 11, 2001, immigration became entangled with national security in ways that permanently shifted the debate. Internal migration patterns. Don't sleep on internal migration, the movement of people within the United States, because the AP treats this as equally significant. The Sun Belt continued its explosive growth during this period. States like Texas, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia boomed, while Rust Belt cities in the Midwest and Northeast struggled with population loss and industrial decline. This wasn't random. People followed jobs, favorable tax environments, lower costs of living, and warmer climates. The political consequences were enormous. Congressional seats and electoral college votes shifted southward and westward, reshaping the national political map. One common AP pitfall is treating immigration and internal migration as completely separate phenomena. They're deeply connected. Immigrants settling in gateway cities like New York and Los Angeles sometimes prompted earlier residents, often working-class white and black Americans, to move to suburbs or other regions, a pattern called secondary migration. The demographics of any given American city in 2005 were the product of multiple overlapping waves of movement, and good AP essays recognize that complexity. Demographic consequences and cultural impact. By 2000, the Census Bureau was noting something historians would call a landmark moment. The Hispanic population had surpassed African Americans as the largest minority group in the United States. The country was becoming what demographers called a majority-minority nation, one where no single ethnic group holds an absolute majority, and this shift was most visible first in states like California, Texas, and New Mexico. Culturally, this manifested everywhere, in food, music, language, religion, and politics. The growth of Spanish-language media, the rise of Spanglish as a living linguistic phenomenon, and the increasing political mobilization of Latino voters were all direct results of this demographic transformation. A helpful mnemonic for the key forces at work. Think it PN as push pull factors just drove immigration. This push pull factor as drove immigration. It's this. Keep those three dynamics in your head, and you can answer almost any AP question on this topic. Understanding these demographic shifts is essential because they don't stay confined to this period. They feed directly into the political polarization, culture war debates, and policy battles that define the next era we're about to explore. Part 9.5. The impact of technological change. The digital revolution and its roots. Let's talk about something you've literally never lived without: the internet. But here's the thing. For most of human history, the idea that you could instantly communicate with someone on the other side of the planet, access virtually all of human knowledge, and order a pizza without speaking to a single person would have sounded like science fiction. The technological transformation that began accelerating in the 1980s is one of the most consequential shifts in American history, and the AP exam absolutely wants you to understand both what changed and why it mattered. Start with the foundation. The development of the personal computer, think Apple and IBM in the late 1970s and early 1980s, put computing power in ordinary homes and offices for the first time. Before this, computers were room-sized machines operated by specialists. Suddenly, a small business owner in Tulsa could manage their books on a desktop. The democratization of technology is your first big theme. Technology moved from institutions to individuals. The internet and the information economy. Then came the internet, and with it, a fundamental restructuring of the American economy. The shift here is enormous, so let me give you an analogy. Imagine the Industrial Revolution moved goods. Factories made things and railroads carried them. The digital revolution moved information and the internet became that railroad. By the 1990s, the World Wide Web had exploded into public life. E-commerce was emerging, and a new kind of economy, sometimes called the knowledge economy or information economy, was taking shape. Workers who could manage, analyze, and communicate information were suddenly at a premium. This is critical for the AP exam. Understand that technological change in this period widened economic inequality even as it created enormous wealth. Highly educated workers in tech hubs like Silicon Valley saw their wages and opportunities skyrocket. Meanwhile, workers in manufacturing, particularly in the Midwest and South, saw their jobs automated or outsourced as technology made cheap, distant labor more accessible. The same innovation that gave us Google also accelerated deindustrialization. Don't lose that tension. It's exactly the kind of complexity AP graders love to reward. Globalization's tech connection. Here's where you need to connect the dots explicitly, because this is a classic AP pitfall. Students treat technological change and globalization as separate topics when they are deeply intertwined. Advances in communication and transportation technology made globalization possible at the scale we saw after 1980. Fiber optic cables under the ocean carrying data at the speed of light. Containerized shipping, reducing freight costs, and just-in-time manufacturing managed through computer systems. All of this knit the global economy together in ways that would have been physically impossible a generation earlier. NAFTA in 1994 and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 were policy choices, yes, but they were enabled by the technological infrastructure that made managing global supply chains practical. Think of technology as the road and globalization as the traffic that ran on it. Social and cultural transformation. The AP exam also wants you to think about technology's social impact, not just its economic one. The rise of 24-hour cable news in the 1980s, CNN launching in 1980, is your anchor date here, fundamentally changed how Americans consumed political information. Then social media in the 2000s and 201 Days went even further, allowing anyone to become a publisher and creating entirely new dynamics around public opinion, political organizing, and the spread of misinformation. Useful mnemonic for the layered social effects. Think, communication transformed, access democratized, politics reshaped, employment restructured. Each of those layers carries exam-ready content. Common AP pitfalls. A few things students consistently get wrong on this topic. First, don't assume technological change was uniformly positive. The AP exam rewards nuance, and you should be prepared to discuss both the opportunities technology created and the disruptions it caused, particularly for working-class communities, for privacy rights, and for traditional industries. Second, don't place the digital revolution in a vacuum. Connect it backward to Cold War defense spending. Since the internet itself grew out of ARPANET, a Defense Department project, there's your continuity thread. Connect it forward to growing debates about surveillance, net neutrality, and the concentration of corporate power in tech monopolies like Amazon and Google. Third, and this one trips up a lot of students, remember that technological change is a cause in AP essays, not just a backdrop. When you're writing about economic inequality in period 9, technology is one of your driving forces. When you're writing about political polarization, media, technology is a causal factor. Train yourself to reach for it as an explanation, not just a detail. Putting it together, the through line of this entire section is transformation and tension. Technology transformed the economy, culture, communication, and America's place in the global order. And it did so while simultaneously creating new divisions between those who could ride the wave and those who got pulled under. That story of uneven progress is deeply American, and it echoes themes you've seen all year. With that framework locked in, we're ready to turn to the political and social debates that define the era, including the culture wars and the shifting landscape of American identity in period 9. Part 9.6, Changes in the American Population. Let's talk about one of the most dramatic transformations in modern American history, not a war, not an election, but something that happened quietly, neighborhood by neighborhood, decade by decade, the reshaping of who Americans are and where they live. Immigration and the new face of America. When the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 dismantled the old quota system, which had heavily favored Western Europeans, it opened the door to a fundamentally different wave of newcomers. Think of it like this. Before 1965, America was essentially running a very exclusive guest list. After 1965, the door swung wide open, and the guests who arrived most enthusiastically came from Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. By the 1980s and beyond, this shift was unmistakable. The Latino population grew explosively, driven by immigration from Mexico, Central America, and South America, as well as high birth rates with established communities. Asian Americans became the fastest growing demographic group in the country, with large communities of immigrants from the Philippines, China, India, Vietnam, and Korea, transforming cities like Los Angeles, Houston, and New York. This is your key exam concept. The post-1965 immigration wave fundamentally changed the racial and ethnic composition of the United States in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. A common AP pitfall here is confusing the cause with the effect. The 1965 Act didn't cause people to want to come to America. People had always wanted to come. It removed the legal barriers that had been keeping them out. Push factors like economic instability, political violence, and war in home countries combined with pull factors like economic opportunity and family reunification in the U.S. to drive this migration. Remember, push and pull like a revolving door. Undocumented immigration and political controversy. Now, not all immigration happened through official channels, and this became a flashpoint in American politics. By the 1980s, millions of undocumented immigrants, largely from Mexico and Central America, were living and working in the United States. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, signed by Ronald Reagan, tried to address this by offering amnesty to nearly 3 million undocumented people already here, while also imposing penalties on employers who hired undocumented workers. It was a compromise that, in practice, satisfied almost nobody long-term because the enforcement side was never fully implemented. This tension between economic reliance on immigrant labor and political pressure to restrict immigration defines much of the debate you'll see on the AP exam from this era forward. The Sunbelt migration. Immigration wasn't the only population story. Millions of Americans were also moving within the country, and the destination of choice was the Sunbelt, the broad arc of states stretching from the southeast through the southwest and into California. Think Florida, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. Why? Air conditioning made southern heat bearable. Manufacturing and defense industries boomed in these regions, and land was cheaper than in the industrial Northeast and Midwest. This internal migration had huge political consequences. The Rust Belt states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania lost population, economic clout, and congressional seats, while Sunbelt states gained all three. This is why you see a political shift toward conservatism in this era. The Sunbelt suburbs were fertile ground for the Reagan Revolution's message of lower taxes and limited government, a handy mnemonic. Sun equals growth. Rust equals decline as G, both economically and politically in period 9. Needing population and the baby boomers. Here's another massive demographic force. The baby boomers, those 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, were aging. By the 1980s, they were in their prime working years, driving consumer culture and economic expansion. By the 2000s and 2010s, they were approaching retirement, which put enormous pressure on Social Security and Medicare. This grain of America is a concept the AP exam loves because it connects demographics to policy debates. More retirees means higher government spending on entitlement programs, which feeds directly into arguments about the federal deficit. Think of the boomers as a pig moving through a python. Everywhere they go in the age distribution, they strain the systems designed to serve that age group. Diversity and political realignment. Here's the big picture synthesis the AP exam wants you to see. All of these changes, more Latino and Asian immigrants, internal Sunbelt migration, and aging white population created a more racially and ethnically diverse America. By the 2000s, demographers were predicting that non-Hispanic whites would become a minority of the total population within decades. This demographic anxiety, combined with economic dislocation, fueled political polarization and debates over multiculturalism, affirmative action, and immigration policy that continue to shape American political life. Don't make the mistake of treating these population changes as just statistics. They are the engine behind almost every major political and cultural conflict of period 9. Who counts as American, who gets resources, whose culture defines the mainstream? These questions flow directly from the number as you move into the next section on American politics and culture. In period 9, keep these demographic shifts in the back of your mind, because every policy debate we discuss next is at its heart a debate about who America is becoming. Part 9.7 Challenges of the 21st Century. The world after the Cold War, a new kind of complexity. All right, picture this. You've spent 40 years training for a boxing match against one specific opponent. You've studied their footwork, their jabs, their patterns, and then the night before the fight, they just don't show up. That's essentially America's situation after the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and suddenly the United States found itself as the world's lone superpower. But the threats didn't disappear. They just got weirder and harder to punch back at. That tension between enormous American power and a newly chaotic, unpredictable world is the engine driving everything in Section 9.7. Keep that framing in your back pocket as we work through it. Terrorism and the post-9/11 world. Nothing reshapes a nation's story like a single morning. And September 11th, 2001 was that morning for the United States. Al-Qaeda, a non-state terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden, coordinated simultaneous attacks using hijacked commercial aircraft, killing nearly 3,000 people and fundamentally altering American foreign and domestic policy. The AP Exam Labs loves to test whether you understand the consequences of 9/11s, not just the event itself. So here's what you need to lock in. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act within weeks, expanding the government's surveillance powers dramatically. The Department of Homeland Security was created, the largest federal reorganization since the 1940s, and President George W. Bush articulated what historians call the Bush Doctrine. The United States reserved the right to launch preemptive military strikes against nations it believed posed a future threat. That's a massive shift in American foreign policy tradition, and it directly led to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Here's a common AP pitfall. Students confuse the justifications for each war. Afghanistan was explicitly connected to harboring al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime. Iraq was justified through claims about weapons of mass destruction. Claims that later proved unfounded, and alleged connections to terrorism. The controversy over those justifications, combined with a prolonged occupation and significant American casualties, eroded public support and fed growing skepticism about the war on terror as a strategy. Economic challenges, inequality, and the Great Recession. Now let's shift gears from bombs to balance sheets, because 9.7 also demands that you understand the economic turbulence of this era. Think of the American economy in the early 2000s as a house built on a foundation that looked solid but was quietly filling with termites. Those termites were predatory lending practices, deregulated financial markets, and a massive housing bubble. When it all collapsed in 2007 to 2008, the result was the recession, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Banks that were too big to fail required government bailouts through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. The unemployment rate spiked above 10%. Millions lost homes to foreclosure. The federal government responded with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, a massive stimulus package under President Obama, echoing FDR-era logic that government spending could kickstart a stalled economy. The AP exam frequently tests you on the debate surrounding these responses. Critics from the right argued that bailouts and stimulus represented government overreach and unsustainable debt. Critics from the left argued the response favored Wall Street banks over ordinary workers. You don't need to pick a side. You need to understand both sides exist and why, because the exam will ask you to analyze multiple perspectives. Immigration, demographic change, and cultural tensions. One of the most significant and ongoing challenges of the 21st century is demographic transformation. The United States is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse at a faster rate than at almost any previous point in its history, driven significantly by immigration, both documented and undocumented. The political debate over immigration reform, border security, and pathways to citizenship became intensely polarized, particularly after 9/11 linked immigration policy to national security concerns in many Americans' minds. Connect this to the APUSH continuity and change over time as teeth. Immigration debates aren't new. Think nativist movements in the 1840s, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, or the quota system of the 1920s. What's new is the scale, the technological context, and the specific political coalitions forming around the issue. That comparison point could absolutely show up on your document-based question. Climate change and environmental policy. If terrorism is a fire that ignites suddenly, climate change is a slow flood, harder to see, harder to legislate against, and deeply contested politically. Scientific consensus by the early 2000s identified human industrial activity as a primary driver of global warming, yet American policy responses remained fragmented. The United States declined to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and domestic climate legislation repeatedly stalled in Congress. The tension between economic interests, particularly in fossil fuel industries, and environmental urgency became one of the defining policy debates of the era. For the AP exam, understand that environmental policy connects to federalism, states like California often led where the federal government lagged, to economic debates, and to America's role in international agreements. Teeing it together. The through line connecting all of these challenges, terrorism, economic instability, immigration, climate change, is this. The 21st century confronted Americans with problems that don't respect national borders, can't be solved by military power alone, and require difficult trade-offs between liberty and security, growth and sustainability, national identity, and global responsibility. That tension is your analytical lens for everything in this section. Coming up next, we'll zoom out and examine how historians and the AP exam framework ask you to synthesize all of period 9 together. So stay with me, because that big picture thinking is exactly what separates a 4 from a 5. Part 9.8, Continuity and Change in Period 9. Setting the stage. All right, let's take a step back, way back, and look at period 9, the way an AP exam reader wants you to look at it as a whole. You've spent time learning about Reagan's revolution, the end of the Cold War, the culture wars, globalization, 9/11, the war on terror, and the rise of the digital economy. Now comes the part that ties it all together. Section 9.8 is your panoramic view from the mountaintop. Think of it like the final scene of a long movie where everything clicks into place. Your job on the AP exam isn't just to know what happened, it's to explain why things changed, and just as importantly, why some things stubbornly didn't. The big continuities. Let's start with what stayed the same, because continuity is just as important as change, and students often overlook it entirely. One of the most powerful continuities running through period 9 is the tension between federal power and individual or state liberty. Sound familiar? It should. That argument stretches all the way back to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. In period 9, you see it in debates over welfare reform, gun control, same-sex marriage, and healthcare. The faces and the technology change. The argument doesn't. Another massive continuity is economic inequality. Despite the booming economy of the 1990s and the technological revolution, the gap between wealthy and working-class Americans actually widened. The rising tide of Reaganomics, the argument Unions declined, manufacturing jobs moved overseas through NAFTA and globalization, and wages for blue-collar workers stagnated. If you wrote an essay comparing period 9 to the Gilded Age, you wouldn't be wrong to draw some uncomfortable parallels. A third continuity is America's role as a global superpower, even as how it exercises that power shifts. The U.S. remained the dominant military and economic force on the planet throughout period 9. What changed was the nature of the threat and the strategy, from Soviet nuclear deterrence to asymmetrical warfare against non-state actors like Al-Qaeda. Same stage, different play. The big changes. Now, for the changes in period 9 is full of them. The most transformative shift is arguably technological. The rise of the internet, smartphones, and social media didn't just change how people communicate, it restructured the entire economy, disrupted journalism, transformed political campaigns, and created entirely new industries. Imagine telling someone in 1980 that by 2010, they could carry a device in their pocket that gave them access to virtually all of human knowledge and also let them order a pizza. That's not incremental change, that's a revolution. Demographically, America changed enormously. Immigration, particularly from Latin America and Asia, reshaped the cultural, linguistic, and political landscape of the country. The Census Bureau projected that by the mid-21st century, non-Hispanic white Americans would no longer constitute a demographic majority, a shift with enormous cultural and political implications that you can already see playing out in the culture wars and immigration debates of the era. Diversity became both a celebrated value and a political flashpoint. Politically, period 9 saw a dramatic rise in polarization and partisan gridlock. The post-WII era had featured genuine bipartisan compromise. Think of the broad coalition that passed the Civil Rights Act. By the 1990s, that cooperation was eroding fast. The Gingrich Revolution, the Clinton impeachment, the contested 2000 election, and the hyper-partisan atmosphere of the 2000s and 2010s all reflect a country increasingly divided along ideological and cultural lines. This is a change you should be able to explain with specific evidence. Common AP pitfalls. Here's where a lot of students trip up. The AP exam loves to ask you to evaluate continuity and change together, not just one or the other. A classic mistake is writing an essay that's all change with no continuity, or vice versa. Real historical analysis acknowledges both. Another pitfall is treating period 9 as isolated. The AP exam rewards students who connect period 9 back to earlier periods, linking Reagan's conservatism to the backlash against the New Deal, or connecting the post-9/11 Patriot Act to earlier debates over civil liberties during wartime, like the Espionage Act or Japanese-American internment. A helpful mnemonic for organizing your continuity and change analysis is steep social, technological, economic, environmental, and political run any major development through those 5 lenses, and you'll rarely miss an important angle. The environment, by the way, is one students often forget. Climate change debates, the Kyoto Protocol, and growing environmental activism are all part of period 9's story. Pulling it together. The core insight the AP exam wants you to demonstrate is this. Period 9 was a period of dramatic transformation in many respects, technologically, demographically, and in terms of America's global role. But it was also a period in which older, deep-rooted tensions about identity, inequality, and the role of government remained very much alive. The new always grows out of the old, and in American history, the old rarely disappears completely. With that panoramic view firmly in your mind, you're ready to think about how these themes connect to the broader arc of American history, which is exactly what the final exam question